A quiet summer afternoon in 1950 began like any other day in a small town in Idaho, where people were accustomed to leaving doors unlocked and children playing outside until dark. No one noticed when a 7-year-old girl slipped out of adult sight for just a few short minutes, a moment that seemed too brief to cause concern. Neighbors continued their daily routines, and the family believed she was just somewhere nearby, as she had been hundreds of times before. Inside that modest home, everything remained intact: a pair of small shoes by the door, a coat hanging on the hook, traces of an ordinary life that hadn't yet realized it was about to shatter. Time passed slowly, then a sense of unease gradually spread as the girl's name was called out loudly with no response. And when the decision to report to the police was made, none of them knew that moment would open a silence lasting more than half a century, where a name disappeared from this town but never truly vanished from the world. Before diving deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1950, Idaho was still a quiet land outside the hurried pace of post-World War II America, where small towns operated on the inertia of habit, familiarity, and mutual trust, where children could walk to school, to church, or to a neighbor's house without causing adults worry. Because in the community's shared perception, danger was something that happened somewhere far away, not here. The Lopez family lived in a typical working-class neighborhood of that era, a one-story wooden house always open during the day, with a daily rhythm repeating steadily between the father's work shifts, the mother's household duties, and family dinners rarely missing any members. Miguel Lopez worked shifts, accustomed to punctuality and discipline. Rosa Lopez tied her life to the kitchen, the small garden behind the house, and caring for the children, a family that wasn't wealthy but stable, with no notable conflicts, not drawing any particular attention from the surrounding community. Barbara Lopez, 7 years old, was the second child in the family, small in stature, quieter than other children her age, used to following instructions, and rarely straying from familiar paths. Each day of Barbara's was evenly divided between school, church, and the familiar yard in front of the house, where she often played with her brother and a few neighbor kids. In the family, Barbara had a special bond with the relative who regularly took her around the neighborhood, someone who was too accustomed to Barbara walking a few steps ahead or stopping to talk with friends, a trust formed from hundreds of uneventful afternoons before that. That afternoon began just like the others, with mild weather, quiet streets, no special events causing anyone to change their usual schedule. Barbara left her familiar spot along the short route, repeated countless times, and in that time, no one in the family felt the need to watch her every step. The unusual factor appeared not as a clear event, but as a small, easily overlooked detail, the presence of a stranger in the otherwise familiar space, a behavior not enough to immediately raise alarm, but sufficient to create a vague feeling, causing the witness to briefly hesitate before reassuring themselves it was just a harmless coincidence. The initial reaction was not fear but hesitation, because in a community where everyone knew each other, suspecting something too soon was often seen as an overreaction, and that very hesitation opened a short but decisive window of time. When the relative returned to look for Barbara in the usual spot, she was no longer there. The initial absence was explained by familiar assumptions like wandering a bit farther, or following friends to another house, and these assumptions delayed an urgent response in the first minutes. The time Barbara was out of the family's control passed silently, with no cries for help, no clear signs of disturbance, just an absence lasting longer than usual, enough to turn waiting into worry. When worry turned to panic, the family began a spontaneous search, calling Barbara's name along the familiar path, knocking on neighbors' doors, asking anyone who might have seen her in that brief period before, but the answers received were vague, no one certain about the timing or her last direction. The search unfolded in chaos, without a plan, each person focusing on a different direction with slim hope that Barbara had simply gotten lost, or was somewhere very close, but as the sun gradually set, and there was no sign she would return on her own, the Lopez family was forced to confront a possibility they had never considered before. The decision to report to the police did not come immediately, but as a result of deadlock, of every familiar safe assumption being successively disproven. The call from the Lopez family was received at the local police station that same evening, in a context where missing child reports in Idaho in 1950 were still considered rare, and usually linked to the possibility of a child wandering off rather than intentional criminal act. So the initial response from the system was not dramatic but procedural. The dispatcher recorded basic information such as Barbara Lopez's name and age, the time the family realized she was no longer where expected, the last known location, and the spontaneous search efforts made before calling the police. Based on the initial facts, the case was quickly classified as a missing child with unclear cause, the urgency level raised due to the victim's age, and the time she had been gone exceeding the usual time frame for a wandering situation, while the approaching night increased the risk with each passing hour. The decision to deploy forces was made shortly after, with a patrol car sent to the neighborhood where the Lopez family lived to directly access the scene, not with a firm assumption of abduction, but to verify the simplest scenarios as quickly as possible before expanding the investigation scope. When the first officers arrived at the Lopez home, they faced a family in evident panic, with information provided out of sequence, dominated by anxiety and guilt, forcing the police to actively control the pace of the exchange to separate confirmed facts from emotional speculation. Approaching the family at this stage was more about gathering data than interrogation. The officers focused on determining Barbara's schedule that day, people who had direct contact with her familiar routes, and any details that could explain this unusually prolonged absence. In parallel, police also noted the scene's condition, though in reality the surrounding area had already been disturbed by the family's and neighbors' spontaneous search activities before authorities arrived, a factor that made preserving initial signs nearly impossible. During the exchange, officers had to repeatedly ask questions to clarify key timelines, especially the last time Barbara was seen, and the interval from then until the family realized she was missing, because that gap would determine the initial direction of the investigation. The collected information showed no clear signs of an accident in the nearby area, nor immediate evidence that Barbara had voluntarily left her familiar range, forcing police to seriously consider third-party involvement. Though at that point this hypothesis could not be prioritized absolutely due to lack of direct evidence. The case classification continued to be updated as risk factors were reassessed. The victim's young age, disappearance without a note, no clear traces, and the family's prolonged unsuccessful search pushed the case beyond the framework of an ordinary wandering incident. On that basis, police decided to open an official missing child file, an administrative step but of significant importance, as it allowed mobilizing additional resources, expanding the search scope, and recording the case in the tracking system, rather than handling it as an isolated incident. In this launch phase, officers also began approaching the nearest neighbors, not to immediately identify suspects, but to collect any observations the family might have overlooked in their initial panic, though most information received was uncertain, reflecting the nature of a community where people rarely paid attention to small details in daily life. Nevertheless, this very vagueness helped reinforce the assessment that the case could not be explained simply, and that delaying deeper investigative steps could narrow the opportunity to find Barbara in the shortest time. As night fell, the decision to open a formal investigation was not only a response to family pressure, but also the result of a quick yet systematic evaluation process, in which police had to balance avoiding unnecessary community alarm with the responsibility to handle a case potentially involving serious crime. From that point, Barbara Lopez's disappearance was no longer an internal family or neighborhood issue, but a recorded, monitored, and procedurally handled case, marking a clear shift from spontaneous search efforts to a formal process, where every subsequent decision would be based on systematically collected, evaluated, and classified data, though at that moment, no one could foresee the complexity and duration of the road ahead. Immediately after Barbara Lopez's missing person file was officially opened, the investigation's focus shifted to reconstructing the final moments before she vanished, because in the absence of clear physical signs, the timeline became the only tool to narrow the search scope and determine the case's initial direction. Officers began by compiling all recorded statements from the family and nearby residents, arranging them in chronological order rather than by reliability, to avoid prematurely discarding seemingly minor details that might hold meaning later. The initial statements mostly revolved around Barbara's familiar activities that afternoon, the time she left her usual spot, the period she was seen on the familiar route, and scattered neighbor observations of a child passing by that no one thought needed special attention. From these facts, police identified the last point where Barbara was certainly seen, a location on the short route connecting her daily familiar points, where many could see her, but precisely because of that, no one felt the need to remember carefully. Determining the last known point relied not on a single statement, but on overlapping multiple sources, where officers had to continually cross-reference what one person said with another's memory, while considering the time elapsed since the incident, reducing memory accuracy. After pinpointing the core area, the investigation proceeded to check the entire route Barbara might have taken in the short time before vanishing, including side paths and less frequented areas, but still within reasonable range for a 7-year-old. This check was not aimed at immediately finding abduction traces, but to rule out Barbara voluntarily leaving her familiar path, getting lost, or encountering an unexpected incident near home, a hypothesis still considered at this stage, due to lack of direct crime evidence. During the sweep, police noted no signs Barbara had gone beyond her usual range, no witnesses confirming seeing her in positions outside the familiar route, gradually reinforcing the assessment that the disappearance occurred in a very narrow space and short time frame. However, as officers conducted deeper interviews with each witness, inconsistencies began to emerge, not as completely contradictory statements, but discrepancies in timing and sequence, one person claiming to have seen Barbara a few minutes earlier than another unsure if the child they saw was truly Barbara, or just one with a similar build. These inconsistencies were not large enough to fully discard any statement, but sufficient to complicate reconstructing an accurate timeline, forcing police to continually adjust assumptions with each new detail. Through cross-referencing and elimination, a key time gap was gradually established, a short period with no certain statements covering it, lying between the last clear sighting of Barbara and the time the family realized she was no longer where expected. This gap became the focus of the entire initial investigative effort, as every possibility, from her wandering off to third-party intervention, had to occur within that time frame. To clarify this gap, police returned to re-interview some witnesses, this time with a more specific goal of pinpointing exactly what happened in those few brief minutes, but the results still lacked the necessary certainty, because human memory is not designed to retain details that, at the time, people did not recognize as important. The lack of a clear event marker in this time gap made every timeline reconstruction effort relative, and that very fact forced police to acknowledge they were working with an incomplete picture, where pieces could fit in multiple ways. Nevertheless, establishing the key time gap was still critically important, as it allowed the investigation to concentrate resources on a specific time frame, rather than spreading efforts across the entire afternoon, while raising core questions about why no one saw anything unusual in such a short period in an area considered safe. As officers concluded the initial timeline phase, they did not have a clear script of what happened to Barbara, but they had determined the case's first boundaries, where the disappearance was no longer a vague, prolonged phenomenon, but compressed into a specific time frame, laying the groundwork for subsequent investigative steps, though these very inconsistencies and gaps also signaled that the road ahead would be far from simple. Once the critical time gap had been established and could not be filled by statements, the investigative team shifted to the action phase by launching formal searches, viewing the systematic sweeping of physical spaces as the most viable path to narrow down the remaining possibilities. The decision was made to expand the search scope beyond the initial spontaneous efforts of the family and neighbors, aiming to cover the entire area directly related to Barbara's familiar route, as well as adjacent zones that might have been overlooked in the early hours. Community mobilization was conducted in a more organized manner, with volunteer groups assigned to specific sectors rather than scattered, to avoid overlaps and ensure spaces were checked systematically, while allowing police to control and document search results by segment. The area was clearly divided into zones, including the residential neighborhood where the Lopez family lived, the routes connecting Barbara's regular activity points, vacant lots interspersed between housing rows, and natural areas within the radius a 7-year-old child could reach in a short time. Searches in the residential area focused on spaces that could obscure visibility or draw little attention, such as backyards, sheds, garages, and outbuildings, with homeowner cooperation to ensure no spot was missed, while natural areas were swept along grids, including riverbanks, trails, overgrown grass patches, and undeveloped land. Although the search effort expanded rapidly, participating forces still faced practical limitations, as enough time had passed for any temporary traces to be erased, and prior foot traffic in the area made the chances of detecting clear signs even slimmer. During the searches, several items were discovered at various locations within the swept zones, items potentially related to Barbara based on the family's initial description, which were immediately collected, and their discovery positions noted for assessing relevance. The discovery of these items did not provide immediate answers but raised new questions, as it could not be determined right away whether they were truly connected to the time of disappearance, or had been present from prior daily neighborhood activities. Officers had to carefully weigh whether to treat these items as significant clues or mere coincidences, avoiding letting expectations influence initial assessments while still keeping open the possibility of their investigative value. Evaluating evidence value in this context depended heavily on discovery location, item condition, and logical connection to the established timeline, but due to the lack of modern analytical tools, conclusions relied mainly on inference and investigator experience. Some items were deemed non-decisive and excluded after cross-checking with information from the family and neighbors, while others were retained for further consideration in relation to the hypotheses under review. Alongside evidence evaluation, the search process also revealed no clear signs of an accidental incident like an injury or prolonged wandering, as no witnesses confirmed seeing Barbara in areas outside the reasonable range, and no traces indicated she had ventured farther than her familiar route, on her own. This gradually narrowed the possibilities for explaining the case in simple terms, forcing the investigative team to seriously consider that the disappearance was not just the result of an unfortunate chain of coincidences, but might involve intentional actions by someone else. However, the absence of decisive evidence meant no hypothesis could be confirmed, and each new discovery, rather than clarifying the picture, tended to add more layers of complexity. As the primary search areas were swept without clear results, efforts continued at high intensity, in hopes that further expansion or rechecking might uncover overlooked details, but in reality, this likelihood diminished over time. By the end of the initial search phase, the investigative team faced a collection of disjointed facts, including some items not fully excludable, but no evidence strong enough to determine what had happened to Barbara in the critical time gap. The formal search, though widely implemented with community participation, did not yield answers but instead established a hard-to-accept reality. If Barbara was still within reachable range by available means, she would have been found, and the failure to locate her or any clear traces meant the investigation would have to shift to more complex directions, where every clue had to be weighed amid information shortages and the tool limitations of that era. The failure to find Barbara in the searched areas and the absence of decisive evidence forced the investigation to shift focus from spaces to people, as if the disappearance could not be explained by accident or getting lost. The remaining possibility lay with individuals who were present, had opportunity, or had close enough ties to intervene in the established critical time gap. The list of potential suspects was formed with maximum breadth, not to accuse but to exclude, encompassing everyone who could reasonably have been in the area that afternoon, from vaguely mentioned strangers by witnesses to those familiar with the neighborhood and the Lopez family, individuals who had never been suspected before. Evaluating each person's connection to Barbara was done based on multiple parallel criteria, with natural access to the victim prioritized, followed by the ability to confirm their location during the critical period, and finally any past factors that might raise suspicion, however minor. Some subjects made the list simply for being seen standing or passing along Barbara's familiar route, even without evidence of direct contact with her, while others drew attention due to social ties close enough for approaching Barbara not to trigger alarm from her or those around. Preliminary interviews were conducted to gather detailed information about schedules and activities on the day of the incident, with police focusing on requiring subjects to describe where they had been, what they had done, and whom they had met, then cross-referencing these statements for consistency or notable discrepancies. The biggest challenge in this phase was that most subjects had no reason to remember every minute of what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, leading to many statements being approximate, based on habits rather than specific memories, making verification difficult. Some initial statements appeared contradictory when compared to other sources, but these inconsistencies were usually minor, not enough to conclude intentional concealment, and fully explainable by natural memory variances. In the process, the investigative team also had to confront the reality that those familiar with the Lopez family, despite no clear suspicious signs, still needed serious consideration, as familiarity was the factor allowing a 7-year-old to approach or follow without resistance or alarm. Interviewing these individuals was done cautiously to avoid unnecessary harm to community relationships, but still had to ensure no possibility was overlooked, just due to familiarity or trust. Through each exchange, some subjects were quickly excluded due to clear alibis, such as continuous presence at another location confirmed by multiple people, or inability to access Barbara in the critical time, and each such exclusion narrowed the scope, but did not bring a real sense of progress. Remaining subjects on the list often fell into gray areas, not enough factors to become primary suspects but not fully excludable either, as their statements lacked independent confirmation, or could not be verified by available means. The absence of modern investigative tools meant police could not go beyond comparing statements and subjective assessments of reliability, a method easily influenced by personal perceptions and the social context of that era. Excluding subjects thus proceeded slowly and inconclusively, with each decision carrying the risk of missing a key detail or pursuing an unsubstantiated direction. Gradually, the initial suspect list narrowed to a very small group of individuals not fully excludable, but this group shared no strong common traits to form a unified hypothesis about motive or method, causing the investigation to become fragmented. With no standout suspect to focus resources, the team had to maintain multiple parallel directions, each consuming time and manpower while none showed breakthrough signs. This reality created an early sense of impasse, as the workload completed did not match the progress achieved, and efforts seemed only to confirm what did not happen rather than clarify what did. Pressure from the Lopez family and community continued to mount, forcing police to balance persistence with not chasing baseless hypotheses just to show the investigation was advancing. The initial suspect identification phase closed without yielding a central figure to guide next steps, leaving a concerning reality that Barbara's disappearance did not fit familiar patterns the team had handled, and that traditional methods based on statements and exclusion might not suffice to break the silence enveloping the case. Failing to establish a clear investigative direction at this point did not mean the case was dead-ended, but it set a clear limit on what could be achieved with available tools, while signaling that without a new clue or mistake from someone involved, the path to resolving Barbara's disappearance would be longer and more complex than initial predictions. The inability to form a central suspect caused the investigation to gradually shift toward receiving and processing information from outside the initial area. As in rare child disappearance cases like this, any report of a child with similar features appearing elsewhere could open new explanations for Barbara's traceless vanishing. Tips began arriving from various localities, mostly civilian observations of a child resembling Barbara at bus stations, stores, markets, or interstate routes, places outside the initial search scope but not fully excludable. Each such tip was recorded and entered into the verification process, not due to high reliability, but because the lack of alternatives forced the team to pursue even the slimmest possibilities. Checking similar cases involved comparing descriptions of appearance, estimated age, and circumstances with known information about Barbara, a process requiring patience and care since mere superficial similarity could lead to false hope if not fully verified. In many cases, initial reports sounded convincing, but quickly revealed mismatches upon closer review, such as differences in height, hair color, voice, or the child's reaction when approached. Some cases required direct coordination with local authorities where the tip originated, involving limited information sharing and delays, due to the lack of a unified national database at that time. These efforts consumed significant time and resources, as each new report forced the team to pause ongoing pursuits to check if Barbara had been taken out of the area, though real probability dwindled over time. In processing tips, the phenomenon of mistaken identification became evident, as many people believed they had seen Barbara based only on a few common traits among children that age, especially as community and local media attention grew, making Barbara's image more familiar in public minds. These identifications often stemmed from good intentions rather than accurate observation, creating short-lived hope for the Lopez family with each new report, only to be quickly dashed after verification. Verifying mistaken identifications required close coordination among multiple parties, from local police to social organizations and families of the misidentified children, a sensitive process prone to causing harm if not handled carefully. In most cases, differences became clear when cross-checking personal details or when the child was confirmed to have family and clear local activity history, forcing police to formally exclude connection to Barbara. Each such exclusion reinforced that external reports, though numerous, did not provide substantive direction for the investigation, mainly reflecting community anxiety and desire to help rather than specific clues. However, completely ignoring these tips was not viable, as the risk of missing a genuine one, however small, always loomed in prolonged disappearances. This put the team in a difficult position, continually balancing pursuit of low-probability leads with focusing resources on other directions that also yielded no clear results. Over time, tip volume decreased, not because possibilities were fully excluded, but due to waning public attention and lack of concrete progress keeping the case from priority in collective awareness. Later similar cases followed the same pattern of mistaken identification and exclusion verification, generating no investigative breakthroughs. This reality highlighted a key limitation of relying on spontaneous tips, without objective data for comparison. All efforts depended on human memory and subjective perception, factors easily distorted by time and emotion. The lack of breakthrough in this phase was not from lack of effort, but the consequence of pursuing all viable directions to the maximum under available conditions, leaving an investigative picture with many checked leads, but none strong enough to guide the next step. The repetition of receiving, verifying, and excluding gradually created a sense of stagnation, as each new cycle only confirmed more of what was wrong, rather than clarifying what happened. For the Lopez family, this phase marked a shift from active hope to passive waiting, as each new tip brought slim possibility of a turning point while reminding them the investigation still faced an invisible wall. For the investigative team, failing to find a breakthrough after numerous verifications forced a reassessment of the entire process, not to pinpoint specific errors, but to acknowledge that the tools and methods in use may have reached their limits. The false leads and mistaken identification phase closed in a suspended state, where processed information volume was higher than ever but actual value lower than expected, and this very contrast helped push the case into a new trajectory, where continuing investigation in the same manner no longer promised different results. The constant pursuit of false leads and mistaken identifications without yielding any verifiable results gradually forced the investigative team to confront an unavoidable reality. The systemic limitations of the era they lived in directly impacted their ability to shed light on Barbara Lopez's disappearance. In the context of 1950, criminal investigation still relied primarily on direct observation and logical inference, completely lacking identification technologies capable of producing objective evidence, causing every verification effort to fall back on basic questions about who saw what, remembered what, and where they might be remembering incorrectly. There were no means to compare biological characteristics, no ability to cross-reference personal traces against a vast storage system, and the few items collected during the search could not be analyzed beyond visual assessment and the personal experience of the investigators. The absence of identification technology meant that hypotheses could not be conclusively verified, because even when suspicion fell on a specific individual, the investigative team had no tools to link that person to the victim with scientific evidence, relying only on statements and conjecture. In those circumstances, human testimony became the primary foundation for the entire investigative process, even though the team was well aware of the fragility of this type of data, especially as time passed and memories were eroded by emotions, repetition, and surrounding influences. Minor contradictions in statements could not be resolved through objective comparison, but were often handled by subjectively weighing the credibility of the informant, a method easily influenced by biases, personal experience, and the social context of the era. The near-total dependence on human memory also made the investigation vulnerable to unintentional errors, where a single misremembered detail could trigger a chain of flawed assumptions with no way to detect them in time. Additionally, the lack of a unified federal data system made information exchange between localities slow and fragmented, with each agency holding only a small piece of the overall picture without the ability to connect them. Reports from other areas, though received and checked, could not be quickly cross-referenced against a nationwide list of missing children, because such lists simply did not exist, and information sharing depended on letters, telegrams, or direct communication between units. This deficiency not only slowed the verification process, but also increased the risk of missing potential connections between similar cases in different localities, isolating each case within its narrow scope. Under those conditions, inference-based investigation became the primary tool to compensate for the lack of data, forcing investigators to construct plausible scenarios based on what they knew about human behavior, social environment, and patterns encountered in the past. Even though they understood that each case had unique aspects that could not be applied mechanically. Inference, in this case, was both a strength and a weakness, as it allowed the team to move forward without concrete leads, but also opened the door to pursuing logically coherent hypotheses that did not reflect what actually occurred. The lack of verification tools made these inferences hard to challenge, and once a hypothesis gained some acceptance, it could influence how new information was interpreted, whether unintentionally or deliberately. Over time, The available investigative methods were exhausted to their maximum, with every familiar approach tested without clear results, making the sense of depleted tools increasingly evident. With no new measures to deploy, no new technology to apply, and no new data to analyze, the investigative team reached a limiting point, where continuing to do more in the same way promised no different outcomes. This exhaustion did not happen suddenly, but accumulated gradually through each fruitless decision, each excluded lead, and each unprovable hypothesis, until it became an undeniable reality. In that context, maintaining the investigation at a high level became difficult, not only due to resource constraints, but also because of the lack of justification for continuing to pursue directions that could no longer expand. These era-specific limitations did not reflect a lack of competence or effort on the part of the investigative team, but were the result of a system not yet equipped to handle complex cases beyond familiar patterns. For the Lopez family, these limitations manifested as prolonged silence and incomplete answers, while for the police, they appeared as invisible walls blocking further progress. Recognizing these limitations did not immediately lead to ending the investigation, but it laid the groundwork for a significant shift in how the case was viewed, from an active search to an increasingly maintenance-oriented file, where the goal was no longer to quickly find a resolution, but to preserve what had been gathered in case the future brought new tools or information. In this state, Barbara Lopez's disappearance existed as an unsolved puzzle within the investigative system of that era, not due to a lack of questions or effort, but because objective limitations had narrowed all possible paths, leaving a void that the technology and methods of 1950 could not fill. The acknowledgement of the limitations of the era's investigative tools and methods led authorities to a phase even more difficult than the search itself, facing the reality that all possible avenues had been exploited to the maximum without generating additional valuable information, and that continuing to maintain the same intensity of investigation no longer yielded results proportionate to the resources invested. Leads once considered promising had been successively ruled out or left unverifiable. Collected items were insufficient to link to any specific individual. Witness statements had been reviewed multiple times to the point of no new details emerging, and tips from outside the area gradually dwindled, reflecting declining public attention rather than new directions. In that context, the investigative team had to reassess the entire file, not to find an immediate breakthrough, but to determine whether any reasonable steps remained untaken, and the final conclusion was that all measures within the era's capabilities had been implemented. The administrative decision to change the case's status was not made hastily or unilaterally, but resulted from multiple internal discussions, in which commanders had to balance the responsibility to continue pursuing the case with the need to allocate resources to new cases with higher resolution potential. Maintaining active investigation for a disappearance without new leads meant prolonging a process without footing, and this, though emotionally difficult to accept, was seen as necessary for overall system efficiency. The Barbara Lopez case file was thus prepared for archiving, an administrative process with profound implications, as it marked the end of the active investigation phase and ushered in a different state of existence for the case within the legal system. Archiving did not mean erasure or forgetting, but reorganizing all collected documents, from statements, search reports, lists of ruled-out suspects, to internal evaluations of considered hypotheses, to ensure that if the case were reopened in the future, the information remained intact and accessible. However, for the Lopez family and the surrounding community, moving the file to storage carried a different meaning, as it meant no more regular calls from police, no more search parties in the neighborhood, and no more updates offering hope, however slim, that the case was progressing. Halting active investigation was a practical decision, but also an admission that at that time, the system had reached its limits, and any further progress would depend on factors beyond current control, such as new information emerging, an unexpected confession, or future technological advancements. In cold case status, the Barbara Lopez case was no longer handled as an ongoing file, but became a preserved document, a collection of facts awaiting suitable conditions for re-examination. This led to the investigators directly involved transferring to other duties, carrying with them the haunting unresolved question, but no longer able to pursue it within daily work. Halting active investigation also changed the relationship between the family and authorities, from continuous interaction to near silence, where contacts became formal or occurred only upon specific request, rather than periodic updates. For the Lopez family, this change created an unfillable void, because during the active investigation period, despite no clear results, the police presence still conveyed that the search for Barbara had not been abandoned, and archiving the file forced them to confront more directly the possibility that answers might not come for a very long time, if ever. Within the system, the case was labeled cold case as a way to classify and manage, but in real life, the label marked a new phase of waiting, where time became the only remaining dominant factor. Documents were neatly filed in storage, names once on suspect lists noted as ruled out, hypotheses once debated closed without conclusion, and everything preserved in readiness, though no one knew when there might be reason to reopen it. This transition did not erase prior efforts, but altered how the case existed in collective memory, from an ongoing event to an unfinished story from the past, where the question of Barbara's fate remained but was no longer raised daily in investigative meetings. The case became a cold case not because it was less important, but because the system could no longer advance with available tools, and this administrative decision, though made for practical reasons, carried significant symbolic weight, marking the boundary between active effort and passive waiting. In that state, Barbara Lopez's disappearance existed as a file sealed in action, but open in questions, a gap in local history preserved in storage, awaiting some future moment, when former limitations could be overcome, and then those dusty pages might be turned again with an entirely different perspective. When the Barbara Lopez disappearance file was moved to storage, and all active investigative activity ceased, her story did not end with that administrative decision, but quietly shifted to another space, where there was no longer the old name, no familiar location, and no direct connection to what had been recorded in the authorities' file. In another state, far enough from Idaho that there was no natural overlap between local communities, a child bearing a different identity began growing up in completely separate circumstances, uninfluenced by the collective memory of the disappearance that had once shocked a small town years earlier. This new life did not begin with a clear event that could be remembered or cross-referenced, but formed through a continuous series of days, where the child's existence was established through daily routines rather than a complete original record. Shifting the perspective to the victim at this stage reveals a different reality of the case, where disappearance did not mean vanishing from social life, but the gradual replacement of one identity with another, sufficient for integration but not enough to create a seamless personal history foundation. Life in the other state provided Barbara, under the new name, an outwardly stable environment, with school, neighborhood, and relationships built from scratch, none of which had reason to question her origins, as the provided information, though vague, was sufficient to meet the social standards of the era. Years passed without any comparison between the current identity and the past left behind, because the administrative system did not require absolute consistency between documents created at different times and places. Barbara's new identity thus existed in a formally valid state, but lacking historical depth, with basic information verifiable within a narrow scope but not traceable back to a clear starting point. The absence of a complete original record meant no central document could connect scattered pieces into a unified story, and this caused no immediate obstacle, because most daily administrative interactions did not require high verification. However, this deficiency quietly shaped how Barbara perceived herself, as questions about birthplace, biological family, or early years were always answered with incomplete, sometimes contradictory information, reflecting the absence of a foundational memory reinforced by official documents. Life in the other state continued with familiar milestones of growing up, education, work, and building social relationships, but all on an identity foundation, not fully verified, a state that Barbara herself might not name, but still sensed through recurring gaps in forms, questions, and conversations. The lack of a clear original record also made any effort to delve deeper into the past difficult, as no agency or organization could provide a definitive answer, and the system was not designed to support tracing personal origins without clear signs of wrongdoing. In that context, Barbara's current identity was not formally challenged, but also not fully reinforced by complete verification, existing as a compromise between societal management needs and the reality of missing information. Two timelines, one the cold case file resting in Idaho storage, the other the ongoing life in another state, continued in parallel without collision, because there was no automatic mechanism connecting data across localities or allowing comparison of missing children lists with individuals living under different identities. This separation enabled a victim to live a full life without knowing she had once been the center of a prolonged and painful investigation, while also leaving the biological family with no signs that the story was unfinished. The incomplete identity gradually became the default state, accepted as part of life, because probing too deeply into the past offered no clear benefit and could even cause unnecessary trouble in a system that prioritized stability over tracing origins. Over many years, no event was significant enough to force re-examination of this identity. No administrative requirement demanded cross-referencing with original records, and no indication suggested that Barbara's current life related to an unsolved disappearance. Shifting the perspective to the victim at this point clarifies a core paradox of the case, where the disappearance recorded by the legal system coexisted with continuous presence in social life, creating a gap between administrative reality and human reality. Barbara existed, grew, and adapted in an environment that did not question what happened before, and the very absence of those questions allowed the story to flow uninterrupted. Her original file, with the name Barbara Lopez, birth date, and details frozen at the moment of disappearance, remained in storage as a static entity, while the new identity continued accumulating experiences, relationships, and responsibilities, without any official thread connecting back to the past. This prolonged parallelism was not only the consequence of an unsolved case, but also evidence of how a system lacking data linkage could allow a person to be detached from their own story for decades. The part of Barbara's life under a different identity thus did not resemble conscious escape or concealment, but resulted from a chain of circumstances and administrative limitations, where the truth was not actively buried, but simply had no path to discovery, until external conditions changed, and the two seemingly unrelated timelines began moving closer together. The parallel existence between a profile frozen in storage and a life continuing under a different name gradually revealed cracks as Barbara's current identity had to interact more with administrative structures that demand consistency over time. And it was at those points of contact that the gaps began to emerge in a quiet but persistent way. The personal documents tied to Barbara's new life, though sufficient for immediate needs, carried unusual signs when placed side by side, not in the form of a major obvious error, but as small mismatched details, such as the recording of birthplace lacking specificity, dates established based on declarations rather than original documents, or guardian names, changing across periods without clear transfer paperwork. These documents were formed in different contexts, by different agencies, and accepted at individual moments without undergoing a comprehensive cross-check, creating a chain that was formally valid, but lacking historical continuity. As the administrative milestones in Barbara's life gradually accumulated, from education to employment and civil transactions, the contradictions in the records began to appear more clearly, not because someone had intentionally forged them, but because there was no strong original profile to serve as a reference point for all comparisons. Requests for information about personal origins were often resolved with temporary explanations, accepted because there was no mechanism requiring deeper tracing, but each such instance added another layer of not fully matching data to the system. The administrative record thus became a collection of individually valid pieces, but contradictory when viewed as a whole, with gaps that could not be filled by existing documents. The inability to trace origins did not cause an immediate crisis, because the system prioritizes the continuity of the present over the absolute accuracy of the past, especially in a context where data was stored in a decentralized manner and not digitized. However, this very decentralization made any effort to trace back fall into deadlock, as there was no central agency responsible for confirming the lifelong consistency of an identity, and each unit could only verify the information it had created itself. When questions about origins were raised, answers often stopped at the level of insufficient data to proceed, a technical response but one that clearly reflected the system's limits. Legal gaps emerged from the very overlap between authorities, where no agency had the obligation or ability to re-examine an individual's entire identity history without specific signs of violation. This created a gray area where the current identity was recognized for practical purposes but not backed by a seamless chain of documents from the starting point. In that gray area, anomalies existed without being challenged, because challenging them required resources and motivation that no one had available. Administrative contradictions, though noticed at individual moments, did not converge into a large enough issue to trigger a comprehensive review, and thus continued to be addressed with temporary measures, further reinforcing the suspended state of the identity. The inability to trace origins also meant the inability to determine the absolute legality of the recorded information, but in practice, this did not prevent daily life from continuing, as systems operate on the assumption that what had been previously accepted is sufficiently reliable. This legal gap was not the result of a single flaw, but a consequence of how administrative systems are designed to handle large volumes of data under limited conditions, prioritizing current needs over restructuring the past. For Barbara, these anomalies did not appear as a sudden discovery, but as a series of small experiences, where providing personal information always came with a sense of uncertainty, where questions about origins could not be answered with the confidence that others had. Nonetheless, these feelings were not strong enough to lead to specific action, as there was no clear sign that digging into the past would bring anything beyond complexity. The contradictory administrative record continued to exist as an unstable foundation, but sufficient to support the current life without collapsing. The absence of a clear original profile meant there was no single reference point to correct deviations, and any spontaneous efforts to reorganize information were limited by the scope of data the individual could access. In the system, these gaps were seen as minor shortcomings, not worth prioritizing in a context of limited resources, and thus not recorded as an issue needing resolution. The contradictions between documents did not create immediate consequences, but they accumulated over time, forming an incomplete picture of identity that no one was responsible for completing. This legal gap not only allowed an identity lacking foundation to exist, but also prevented any efforts to cross-reference between different systems, as there was no standard process to connect data created at different times and places. In that context, Barbara's identity existed as a legal entity, but not fully authenticated, accepted because it did not cause direct conflict with the current order. The gaps continued to be covered by the smooth operation of daily life, and the inability to trace origins became a prolonged state, rather than a problem to solve. It was this prolongation that allowed the gap to persist for many years without being systematically questioned, creating conditions for the two timelines, the archived past and the ongoing present, to continue in parallel without intersecting. The part of life under Barbara's different identity was thus built on an incomplete but sufficiently durable legal foundation, reflecting how small system gaps can combine into a large void where the truth is not actively concealed, but simply has no clear path to be discovered. The unfilled identity gaps continued to exist as a silent background as Barbara passed through the stages of adulthood, and in that process, the two separate lives became increasingly distinct. One life recorded in the system with the current identity, and another life frozen in the archived records of Idaho, both coexisting without an official intersection. Adulthood unfolded according to society's familiar milestones, with completing basic education, joining the workforce, and gradually taking on the roles of an adult, every step confirmed by valid documents in a narrow scope, sufficient to open necessary opportunities without requiring deep origin verification. In the new environment, Barbara formed social relationships based more on the present than the past, where stories told revolved around what was happening rather than what had occurred, and this focus helped life run smoothly despite lacking a full personal historical foundation. A private life was gradually built with personal choices, stable work, a fixed residence, and relationships lasting long enough to create a sense of belonging, all occurring in a social space that did not question the early years lacking information. The lack of contact with the biological family did not stem from a conscious decision to cut off the past, but was a natural consequence of having no specific data, memories, or clues to direct towards such a connection, as there was no clear starting point to begin a search journey. In the current life, family relationships were defined by those present around her, those who had shared time and experiences, rather than by blood ties recorded on paper, and this was accepted as a norm without needing further explanation. The two lives continued in parallel in a non-conflicting way, one side a timeline operating with full responsibilities, obligations, and relationships of the present, the other a static timeline in storage, where the name Barbara Lopez was tied to an age that never changed, and an unsolved question. The distance between these two timelines was maintained not by intentional concealment, but by the absence of a connecting mechanism, as no system automatically questioned whether an adult in another state might be related to an old missing person case from decades earlier. While the current life accumulated new milestones, from career to deeper personal relationships, the old record remained with its initial information, neither updated nor compared to any new data, creating a paradox where the same person existed in two completely different contexts. Adulthood bringing new responsibilities made the past less important in daily decision-making, and questions about origins, though sometimes arising, were often set aside because they offered no clear practical value in the current context. The private life was reinforced over time by commitments and obligations, from work to a separate family, creating a network of ties that made turning back to question the past more difficult, not due to lack of courage, but lack of a strong enough reason to disrupt the built stability. No contact with the biological family meant no shared memories, no shared stories to suggest a connection, and that emptiness did not cause clear loss because it had never been filled. The two parallel lives thus did not oppose each other, but existed as separate realities, each validated within its scope, and not challenged by the other. In the community where Barbara lived under the current identity, there was no reason to doubt or question the legality of the ongoing life, as all interactions were based on verifiable facts in the present, and the distant past was not seen as a determining factor. Conversely, in the community where the disappearance had occurred, Barbara's life was frozen at age 7, mentioned as a painful memory, but without continuation, and over time, that memory also gradually faded in daily life. This parallelism was maintained over many years by the very stability of each side, as no event was strong enough to break the invisible boundary separating the two timelines. The lack of contact with the biological family also meant no reverse flow of information, no questions or signals sent back to Idaho, suggesting that the cold case file might need re-examination, and this silence was interpreted by the system as a sign that the case had receded into the past. In the current life, Achievements and failures were recorded as those of an independent individual, not tied to the missing person story, and this further reinforced the separation between the two realities. The two lives existing in parallel were not like two sides of the same coin, but like two straight lines running beside each other without intersecting, each with its own logic and rhythm. It was this non-intersection that created a complex picture of the long-term consequences of an unresolved disappearance, where the victim was not only separated from biological family, but also separated from her own story in the recording system. Barbara's adult life continued moving forward, with all the necessary changes and adaptations, while the other life remained still in a state of waiting, and the distance between those two lives was not measured in years but in the absence of connection. This prolonged parallel existence did not create immediate conflict, but it laid the foundation for a larger paradox, where a person can live a full life without knowing that a core part of her personal story still lies in an unclosed file, and where a case can be seen as dormant in the system, while its consequences continue unfolding day by day in real life. The seemingly stable prolonged parallelism of the two lives began to show small cracks as Barbara's current identity was forced to interact with more complex administrative procedures, where details once overlooked or passively accepted no longer stayed in their separate scopes, but started colliding with each other in the same context. An administrative anomaly appeared not as a shocking discovery, but as a slight misalignment, a request for information that could not be fully met with available data, causing the procedure to take longer than usual and forcing additional questions that had never been asked before. Forms that had been familiar now became more difficult to handle when sections related to birthplace, biological family information, or personal history required higher accuracy, and previous answers that had been accepted now began revealing inconsistencies when cross-checked within the same file. It was in these seemingly minor moments that doubts about identity began to emerge, not as a clear hypothesis, but as a vague feeling that something in the personal story had not been fully explained. This doubt did not arise from a specific memory or newly revealed information, but from the repetition of familiar gaps. As each time origin information was requested, the response relied on assumptions or secondary information that could not be verified. The emergence of doubt did not immediately lead to specific action, because in a context of a stably built life, digging into the past offered no clear benefit and could even cause unnecessary disruption. However, this sense of uncertainty did not disappear but lingered quietly, reinforced each time a new administrative detail did not fully match what had been previously recorded. The search for personal information began cautiously, not as a targeted investigation, but as an effort to fill small gaps in one's life story, through reviewing old documents, re-asking those who had provided information before, and cross-checking what could be accessed personally. This process quickly revealed the limits of available data, as documents provided no additional information beyond what was already recorded, and involved people could not offer more specific answers because they too relied on similarly vague sources. The initial search efforts did not yield any clear discovery, but they highlighted the absence of a reliable original profile, a starting point to which all other information could refer. Having no clear answers to basic questions about personal origins meant the doubt could not be resolved, but only shifted to a suspended state, existing as an open question mark in awareness. The lack of clear answers did not mean the doubt was dismissed. On the contrary, it reinforced the feeling that the current information system was insufficient to explain the entire story. In the process of searching for information, small contradictions between documents began to become clearer, not because they were new, but because for the first time they were placed side by side with the goal of seeking consistency, a goal that had not existed before. Dates that did not fully match, place names recorded in different ways, and relationships described with inconsistent terms all contributed to creating a picture lacking connection. These contradictions were not enough to lead to a specific conclusion, but they were sufficient to rule out the possibility that everything was as simple as it appeared. The absence of clear answers meant doubts about identity could not be resolved with a single administrative action, but required a broader search process, extending beyond personal scope and available documents. However, expanding the search encountered practical barriers, as there was no centralized database, no clear guidance for tracing personal origins in cases without signs of fraud, and no agency responsible for proactively supporting such a process. In that context, the doubt existed as a question with no official place to be posed, an unease not recorded by the system, but still affecting self-perception. Spontaneous efforts to search for personal information continued within the limits of access, but each attempt ended at the same point, where existing data could not lead to a new conclusion. The repetition of no answer results created a vicious cycle, as doubt drove the search, and the search led back to the absence of answers, further reinforcing the initial doubt. In this process, there was no sign that deeper investigation would yield a decisive discovery, and that kept the doubt about identity from turning into specific action, but existing as a background layer in awareness. The lack of clear answers not only reflected data limits, but also the system's limits in handling questions beyond normal management frameworks. The doubt thus was neither resolved nor extinguished, but set aside as an unsolved issue, existing in parallel with current life without directly interfering in daily decisions. However, the existence of this doubt changed the way seemingly minor administrative details were viewed, as each new information request was received with higher vigilance, and each contradiction, even small, was remembered rather than ignored. Gradually, doubt about identity became an inseparable factor in personal experience, not as a constant obsession, but as a foundational unanswered question, quietly shaping the approach to the past. The absence of clear answers also meant no natural stopping point for the search process, and this kept the doubt in an open state, ready to be reactivated when a new strong enough factor appeared. Meanwhile, the two timelines continued in parallel, with the current life moving forward, and the old record still lying dormant in storage, but the distance between them began to narrow in perception, as for the first time there existed a suspicion that they might be related in some way. This part of life ends not with a discovery or conclusion, but with the formation and existence of doubt, marking the shift from passive acceptance to a questioning state, a small but meaningful step in the long journey, where the truth has not yet had the chance to be named. The persistent existence of doubts about identity, though still lacking clear form, began to find a new foothold when changes outside the individual opened up access to a type of information that had never existed before, and this very change shifted the focus from incomplete paperwork to biological data capable of overcoming administrative limitations. DNA technology, which had once existed only in the specialized realm of forensics, gradually became more common in civilian life through voluntary testing programs, allowing individuals to access analyses of their genetic origins without needing a criminal case or specific legal requirement. The widespread application of this technology did not happen as an instant revolution, but as an accumulative process where commercial laboratories began building databases based on the participation of millions of individuals, each contributing a small part to an ever-growing genetic picture. In that context, an individual in Barbara's family line, with no direct connection to the disappearance or the ongoing identity doubts, took a DNA test for personal reasons, perhaps to learn about ancestral origins or to connect with distant family branches. This action was not tied to any expectation of clarifying an old story, and at the time it was done, it was simply a personal choice within a spreading social trend. The DNA data obtained from this test was recorded and entered into an automated comparison system where algorithms continuously matched genetic sequences to find degrees of similarity between different samples, a process that occurred silently without requiring direct human intervention. In that system, each DNA sample existed as an encoded set, carrying no personal story or context, and only when a match exceeded a certain threshold was a potential connection flagged. The emergence of the genetic link did not come as a dramatic announcement, but as a technical result, an indicator showing that two DNA samples shared a large enough percentage of genes to suggest a blood relationship. This link, in its initial stage, existed only as data, not attached to any interpretation about identity or history, and required additional confirmation steps to rule out random coincidence. The recorded data not only reflected similarity between genetic sequences, but also provided estimates of the degree of relationship, allowing inferences about the position of the connection within the broader family tree. It was at this point that DNA technology began to act as a connecting tool, not just between living individuals, but also between the present and the past, since genetic connections are not limited by time or space. In this case, the discovered link did not match any known family relationship, creating a technical question mark about the existence of an unrecorded branch or an individual with common origins, but not in the current family records. The appearance of an unexpected genetic link forced those involved to consider the possibility that there was a story not fully recorded in family history, one that could not be explained solely by existing documents. DNA data, in this context, functioned as a type of evidence independent of memory or testimony, providing an objective basis for questioning personal origins that had previously existed only as vague doubts. The shift from administrative suspicion to biological evidence marked a significant turning point, as it opened up the possibility of comparison beyond the barriers of the fragmented and unconnected system that had existed for decades. However, the emergence of a genetic link did not mean the truth was immediately revealed, since DNA data only provides the relationship, not the context, and interpreting it requires a combination of science and investigation. In the early stage, this link existed as a signal, an indicator that two seemingly unrelated data lines might share a biological origin, but it could not yet answer questions about identity or the circumstances leading to that separation. The application of DNA technology in a civilian context also imposed certain limits, as privacy rights and the scope of data use had to be respected, making the transformation of a technical result into an official investigation impossible immediately. Nevertheless, the existence of this data completely changed the context of the prior doubts, as for the first time there was an element independent of memory or documents, suggesting that Barbara's current identity might not reflect the full truth about her origins. The genetic link appeared as a thin but durable thread, enough to connect seemingly scattered pieces, and though the full picture could not yet be seen, its existence confirmed that continuing the search was no longer based on feeling or speculation, but had a scientific foundation to guide it. The data recorded in the system did not tell the story itself, but it forced those accessing it to ask new questions, extending beyond the personal sphere to larger structures of family history and social records. In that context, DNA technology served not only as a technical tool, but also as a catalyst, turning simmering doubts into a specific possibility that needed serious consideration. The emergence of the genetic link, though not yet fully explained, created a potential intersection between two timelines that had existed in parallel, opening the possibility that long-standing identity gaps and doubts could be approached from an entirely new angle. This part of the life does not end with a definitive conclusion, but with the recognition that an objective factor had appeared in the picture, enough to change the entire perspective on the story, and lay the groundwork for the next steps, where biological data could do what documents and testimonies had never achieved: create a connection across time between a living person and a story seemingly frozen in the past. The emergence of the genetic link no longer remained at the level of an abstract technical signal when the comparison results were updated and clarified further, turning the initial data into a specific meaningful match, strong enough to force those accessing it to recognize it as a real connection, rather than just a statistical possibility. In the analysis system, the degree of similarity between the DNA samples exceeded the threshold typical of random coincidences, indicating a closer blood relationship than the distant connections commonly seen in large databases. And this very degree made the result impossible to ignore or explain, simply as a coincidental overlap. Determining the blood relationship did not happen with a definitive statement from the start, but through technical indicators, where the gene-sharing ratio was converted into specific possible relationships, thereby narrowing the scope to those that could realistically exist, such as close relatives rather than distant branches. These results were examined in the context of known family information, and the mismatch between the genetic data and the current family tree made the connection particularly notable, as it suggested the existence of an individual in the lineage not recorded in existing documents. Evaluating the reliability of the match became the next critical step, as in the field of DNA. Accuracy depends not only on the match ratio but also on sample quality, the number of markers compared, and how the data was processed. Laboratories rechecked the process to ensure the result was not affected by technical errors, sample contamination, or analysis mistakes, and this retesting further strengthened confidence that the detected link had a solid scientific basis. In parallel, genetics experts considered whether other relationships could produce a similar match level, to rule out low-probability scenarios that still needed consideration to avoid hasty conclusions. Through this evaluation process, the DNA match was gradually confirmed as reliable evidence of a blood relationship, though the exact identity of the missing individual in the family tree could not yet be determined. The transition from a technical result to a practical discovery marked a significant turning point, as for the first time, the story of personal origins was no longer based on speculation or administrative gaps, but had a verifiable scientific foundation. However, the objective nature of DNA also posed a new challenge, as this data was not automatically tied to a legal record or specific case, and using it to trace back history required involvement from authorized agencies. In that context, the decision to notify authorities was not an immediate reflex, but the result of careful consideration, as it meant bringing personal data into an official process that could lead to profound legal and social consequences. The notification was carried out through appropriate channels, providing authorities with necessary information about the DNA match, the determined degree of blood relationship, and the data's limitations, to ensure it was not misunderstood or exaggerated beyond its scientific scope. For the authorities, this information appeared as an unexpected signal from outside the system, data not in existing records, but potentially directly related to unresolved cases from the past. Receiving the notification did not mean immediately reopening an investigation, but it required the responsible units to consider the possibility that a seemingly dormant file might connect to a living individual, based on biological evidence rather than testimony or inference. The DNA match, in this case, acted as a bridge between two previously independent systems, the modern genetic database and the old legal records, and this intersection created a new space for re-examining assumptions that had persisted for decades. Reliability evaluation continued at the administrative level, as authorities had to determine whether the DNA data met necessary standards to serve as a basis for further steps, a process requiring caution to avoid relying on a single piece of evidence while ignoring other factors. In this process, the DNA match was not seen as a complete answer but as a new starting point, opening the possibility of risking old questions in a different light. The confirmed existence of a blood relationship meant that previous identity gaps could no longer be explained simply as administrative shortcomings, but became signs of a real separation between biological and legal identity. Notifying authorities was thus not just an act of sharing information, but the first step in bringing the story from the personal and scientific realm back into the official investigative space. The DNA match, with all its reliability and limitations, created new pressure on the system, forcing it to respond to a type of evidence that old methods had never handled. This data did not provide context, motive, or circumstances leading to the separation, but it confirmed that a real connection existed, enough to challenge the frozen state of old files. This part of the story ends at the point where the DNA match is recorded and transferred to the competent authorities, not as a final conclusion but as an unmistakable signal, marking the moment when science began to intervene directly in a story once limited by time and the deficiencies of the old system, opening the possibility that what was once considered untraceable could now be approached through an entirely different path. The information about the DNA match being forwarded to authorities created a specific connection between modern biological data and a missing person file that had lain dormant in storage for decades, making it impossible for the system to continue treating the case as a document closed in terms of action. The cold case unit received the information according to the initial screening process for new data sources, where the most important aspect was not the attention-grabbing nature of the result, but its validity, where the data came from, how the DNA sample was collected and analyzed according to what standards, how the match level was expressed, and whether the result had sufficient reliability to become the basis for activating further procedural steps, or only remained at the suggestive level. The reception phase therefore began with requesting accompanying technical documents, including summaries of testing methods, the number of markers compared, genetic similarity indicators, and estimates of the degree of blood relationship, while verifying whether the data had been independently validated. When investigators assessed that the DNA result showed signs of exceeding random coincidence thresholds, and was consistent with a relatively close blood relationship, they moved to the step of connecting old and new data, a task that could not be done by simple pasting, but required building a verifiable chain of reasoning based on historical records. The 1950 Barbara Lopez file was retrieved from storage, checked for document completeness, marked for missing or absent pages, reviewed the evidence catalog and interview transcripts, and compiled a modern standard operational summary, so the entire team had a common background picture. Reviewing the 1950 file at this stage was not aimed at retelling the case in the old way, but at answering structural questions: where the victim was last seen, how key time gaps were established, which investigative directions were pursued, why they reached dead ends, which hypotheses were discarded due to lack of tools rather than being refuted by evidence, and which elements in the file were accurate enough to serve as reference points for modern data. The cold case unit created a comparison table between the two information systems, one side with fixed details from the missing person file, name, age at disappearance, recorded biological family, location, key witnesses, identity documents; the other side with DNA data, estimated relationship level, matching genetic branch, minimal information legally obtainable from the provider. The key point of data connection was determining whether the matching DNA sample could fall within the bloodline of the Lopez family in Idaho, and if so, where that blood distance placed the unidentified individual in the family tree relative to Barbara Lopez per the 1950 file. This was the step shifting from scientific result to investigative hypothesis, and the cold case unit had to handle it by constructing plausible relationship scenarios: siblings, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, close cousins based on genetic indicators, then cross-checking each scenario against historical facts such as age, generation, geography, and social plausibility. Reviewing the 1950 file continued deeper into personnel lists, where investigators revisited names of key witnesses, informants about strangers or unusual behavior, and notes on previously checked subjects, not to resume old suspect hunts, but to assess the possibility that a child could have left Idaho without leaving strong enough traces in that era's conditions. At the same time, the cold case unit examined the quality of previously collected physical evidence, its storage condition, and availability under modern standards, as a crucial part of old-new data connection was determining whether independent comparison was possible. In cases where the old file no longer had usable biological evidence, the unit still had to establish an alternative verification plan based on chain comparison, multi-branch blood relationship matching, cross-confirmation with administrative data, and consistency checks of life milestones related to the matching individual. This phase required a parallel legal process, as the cold case unit could not arbitrarily access personal data from commercial DNA systems or administrative records without proper grounds and authority. Thus they had to work with the legal department to determine permissible access scope, document request procedures, and ways to ensure chain of custody if the data was later used in official conclusions. Connecting old and new data also included standardizing identity information of the Lopez family in the 1950 file: names, ages, blood relations, surviving or deceased relatives over time, residence changes, as these factors determined the feasibility of verifying genetic relationships. The cold case unit rebuilt the family tree to modern investigative standards, separating confirmed branches from speculative ones, then placed the DNA match in the diagram as a data node needing explanation. The important point here was avoiding confirmation bias. The DNA result might tempt investigators to immediately assign the matching individual as Barbara, but procedural rules required treating it as a strong hypothesis needing verification, not a conclusion. Therefore, reviewing the 1950 file also aimed to find details usable as exclusion criteria. If hypothesis A is true, then fact X must fit. If hypothesis B is true, then fact Y must appear. This approach prevented the investigation from sliding into speculation. When the compatibility level between genetic data and historical records reached a sufficiently convincing threshold, the unit proceeded to the most important administrative step, formally reopening the investigation. Reopening was not just changing the status label in the system, but entailed rights and obligations, assigning a lead investigator, creating an investigation plan, assigning tasks for document collection, setting verification objectives, and opening coordination channels with related agencies. Formally reopening the investigation also required clearly recording the basis new DNA data, reliability assessment, potential relevance to the Barbara Lopez file, and priority goal of legally and accurately determining identity. Internally, the cold case unit simultaneously established information control principles, as the case involved a living individual and could lead to major social consequences. Every step needed to ensure no unnecessary harm. If the initial hypothesis was wrong, the 1950 file was digitized, if not already, for faster analysis and internal sharing. Old interview transcripts were extracted into searchable data, and previously ambiguous parts were flagged for re-evaluation under the new hypothesis. Formally reopening the investigation put the Barbara Lopez file back into active orbit, where DNA data was no longer just a number in a commercial system, but became the operational starting point, forcing old documents to be reread, old assumptions to be re-examined, and the system to acknowledge that the 1950 story might have unfolded in a way beyond the recognition capabilities of that era. At this point, the file was no longer an unfinished story in storage but a reactivated case with a specific goal: connecting biological truth to legal truth, thereby clarifying what decades earlier could not be clarified using tools reliant only on testimony and inference. The official reopening of the case led to a distinctive type of investigation that the cold case unit rarely had to deploy at such depth, where the focus was no longer on a single chain of events, but on placing two timelines separated by decades on the same analytical axis to identify any possible intersection between them. One was the timeline of the 1950 disappearance, established from statements, reports, and assumptions of that era. The other was the timeline of an adult life under a different identity, reconstructed from administrative milestones, population data, and modern biological information. Matching the two timelines was not a mechanical side-by-side comparison, but a process of peeling back layers of information to determine whether there was any continuous chain that could connect the endpoint of the first timeline to the starting point of the second. The cold case unit began by standardizing the key timestamps in the 1950 file from the date of disappearance, Barbara's age at that time, to details about her biological family and geographic context, then cross-referencing them with the life milestones of the individual matching the DNA, such as the recorded date of birth, declared place of birth, first appearances in administrative systems, and signs of geographic movement. This matching quickly revealed that the two timelines did not overlap directly, as the current identity did not appear in Idaho at the time of the disappearance, but the very gap between those points became the area requiring the deepest analysis. Investigators focused on the transitional period, where a child vanished from one recording system and another child appeared in a different one, because if the identity hypothesis was correct, the intersection was not a clearly documented event, but an inadequately recorded period of time. Identifying the intersection therefore did not mean finding a specific date or location, but narrowing down a plausible window where the identity shift could have occurred without leaving official traces. The cold case unit analyzed population data, school enrollment records, medical files, and the earliest administrative milestones of the current identity to determine the first moment that individual was recognized by the system, then compared it to the disappearance date to assess whether there was reasonable compatibility in terms of age and social context. Determining the intersection also required evaluating travel scenarios, because if the two timelines could be connected, there had to be a realistic path for that movement under the transportation and social conditions of the mid-20th century. Investigators examined routes, migration patterns, and economic social contexts that could facilitate a child leaving Idaho and appearing in another state without detection, not to reconstruct a specific journey, but to establish the overall feasibility of the hypothesis. Alongside searching for the intersection, the cold case unit faced another major risk: random coincidence, where in a vast genetic database, seemingly meaningful connections could emerge unrelated to the case at hand. Ruling out random coincidence became a mandatory task, because without clarifying this factor, the entire intertime period investigation could collapse. To do so, investigators did not rely on a single DNA match, but sought supporting similarities, such as alignment in age, geographic context, family structure, and life milestones, to build a chain of connections dense enough to exceed the threshold of randomness. Each factor considered individually might not be decisive, but when placed together in an overall model, they allowed an assessment of the probability that the two timelines truly belonged to the same person. Ruling out random coincidence also involved comparing against alternative scenarios, such as the possibility that the DNA match reflected an unrecorded different family branch unrelated to Barbara, and evaluating whether those scenarios fit the historical and administrative data. Throughout this process, the cold case unit continuously adjusted the hypothesis, treating it not as a fixed conclusion, but as a working model that could be falsified if contradictory data emerged. As random possibilities were progressively eliminated, the identity hypothesis began to strengthen, not through a single piece of evidence, but through the convergence of multiple independent factors, each limited on its own, but together forming a coherent picture. Strengthening the identity hypothesis required a high degree of caution, because its implications went beyond solving an old case to redefining the legal and historical identity of a living person. Investigators therefore had to ensure that every inference could be traced back to specific data sources, avoiding the construction of a narrative based on unfilled gaps. Intertime period investigation in this context did not aim to fully recreate the past, but to determine whether the past and present truly belonged to the same continuous line, a question requiring the combination of science, history, and investigative logic. When the two timelines were placed side by side with plausible intersections identified and random possibilities reasonably excluded, the cold case unit began to see a connecting structure strong enough to proceed to higher-level verification. This did not mean every question had been answered, but that the identity hypothesis had moved beyond initial speculation to become a formal investigative direction with foundation. The existence of an intersection, even if not specifically pinpointed in time and space, allowed investigators to conclude that the two timelines were not entirely independent as previously assumed, and that a person disappearing from the system in 1950 and appearing in another system afterward was no longer inexplicable. Inter-time period investigation thus served as a bridge, not to deliver a final judgment, but to create a logical foundation for subsequent verification steps, where the identity hypothesis was no longer based on intuition or suspicion, but on measurable compatibility between past and present data. This part of the story ends at the point where the two timelines, once existing parallel without touching, have now been placed in the same analytical frame, with intersections identified at a structural level, opening the possibility that what was once seen as unfillable voids were merely segments not yet viewed with the right tools and at the right moment. The structural strengthening of the identity hypothesis forced the cold case unit to move to the most sensitive and rigorous phase of the entire process, where all inferences had to be replaced by legal confirmation capable of withstanding any independent scrutiny. Independent DNA testing became mandatory, not only to increase scientific reliability, but also to completely eliminate the risk of error from relying on a single data source. Biological samples were collected under current forensic protocols, ensuring strict chain of custody from collection to analysis, and sent to independent laboratories unrelated to the commercial system that produced the initial match. Analysis was conducted to higher standards, using more markers and in-depth comparison methods to precisely determine the degree of blood relation, not just at a probability level, but at a level usable as legal basis. Results from these independent analyses were cross-checked for consistency, and only when conclusions aligned within allowable error margins was the DNA data considered strong enough for the next step. Alongside DNA testing, the legal record comparison process was launched to validly connect biological identity to administrative identity, because identity confirmation could not rely solely on science, but had to be anchored in the current legal system. Investigators reviewed all civil records related to the current identity, including birth certificates, school enrollment files, medical records, population registrations, and documents establishing legal status across life stages, to confirm the continuous existence of the living individual. These records were placed alongside the 1950 Barbara Lopez file, not to find surface matches, but to determine compatibility in terms of timing, age, and social circumstances, thereby ruling out the possibility that the DNA match reflected a different unrelated relationship to the disappearance. Legal record comparison also included verifying previously noted administrative anomalies, re-evaluating them from the new perspective to see whether they could be explained as consequences of an unrecorded identity shift. Relevant agencies coordinated to confirm the legitimacy of each document, ensuring no active fraud concealed the truth, and that existing gaps resulted from historical context and system limitations rather than intentional legal violations. As independent DNA data and legal records began to converge, the cold case unit proceeded to the final identity confirmation step, a process not carried out by unilateral decision, but through consultation with forensic, legal, and administrative experts to ensure the final conclusion reflected the evidence's degree of certainty. Final confirmation aimed not only to establish that the living individual was the Barbara Lopez who disappeared in 1950, but also to determine the legal way to record that in the system without harming rights established over the current lifetime. Arising legal questions were carefully considered, from updating names in records to handling differences between old and new identities, to ensure confirmation did not create unnecessary legal conflicts. When involved parties reached consensus that evidence had surpassed all required thresholds, the identity conclusion was officially confirmed, marking the moment the investigative hypothesis transformed into legal fact. Official record updating became the final step of this phase, in which the cold case file was adjusted to reflect the confirmation result, changing status from unresolved missing person to victim identity determined, a change with profound operational and symbolic meaning. Updating did not occur in a single system, but spread to related databases, ensuring new information was consistently recorded and retrievable in the future, without creating further conflicts. The Barbara Lopez file, once existing as a frozen set of documents in storage, was now revived with updates reflecting the decades-long journey from disappearance to confirmation, and this updating closed a multi-generational investigative phase. However, legal identity confirmation did not carry emotional or social closure, as it only resolved the question of who without touching the questions of why and how that led to the prolonged separation. Nevertheless, at the system level, completing identity confirmation marked a rare achievement in inter-time period investigation, where science, history, and law converged to resolve a case seemingly locked by time. Official record updating also carried responsibility for communication and information management, as this conclusion could affect many parties, from biological family to the community where the victim once lived, and the cold case unit had to ensure all released information was accurate, cautious, and respectful of privacy. At this point, the Barbara Lopez case reached a decisive milestone, when identity was no longer a hypothesis needing verification, but a reality, confirmed by both science and law, creating a solid foundation for subsequent steps in addressing the remaining consequences of a disappearance lasting over half a century. The legal confirmation of identity created a profound shift in the case's focus, as the investigation no longer revolved around who Barbara Lopez was but shifted to handling the real-world consequences of a person having been separated from her biological family for over half a century. Arranging a meeting became a process requiring special caution, as it was not merely a personal event, but a step that could strongly impact many parties, from the victim, biological family, to agencies involved in identity confirmation. The cold case unit coordinated with psychological experts and legal advisors to develop an appropriate contact plan, where the goal was not to create a dramatic moment, but to ensure the meeting occurred in safe, controlled conditions respecting everyone's emotions. Determining who would participate in the first meeting, where and in what format was carefully considered, as each choice carried its own consequences, and a hasty decision could cause unnecessary harm. When involved parties were informed of the identity confirmation result, initial reactions were recorded as part of the post-investigation process, not to judge emotions, but to understand expectations and concerns that might affect the meeting. Family relationship confirmation at this stage occurred not just on paper, but through re-establishing blood ties long interrupted, a process requiring time and patience rather than immediate declarations. The first meeting was organized as a symbolic starting step, where truth confirmed by science and law was confronted through human experience, and all unnecessary pressure factors were minimized to the greatest extent. In that context, reunion was not viewed as the story's ending, but as the launch of a new phase, where relationships had to be rebuilt from zero, not based on shared memories, but on mutual acknowledgement in the present. Recording the real-world consequences of the reunion became an inseparable part of the case, as identity determination and meeting biological family brought a series of changes in Barbara's life, as well as that of surviving relatives. These changes did not occur all at once, but emerged gradually over time, from adjusting personal information in administrative records to redefining family relationships that had existed for years without Barbara's presence. Relevant authorities monitored this process not to interfere in private lives, but to ensure arising consequences were handled within legal frameworks and necessary support was provided when needed. Family relationship confirmation also raised practical questions about rights, responsibilities, and social recognition, issues that could not be resolved by a single meeting, but required long-term adjustment. In this phase, the cold case unit gradually withdrew from the central role, shifting from active investigation to oversight and support, as their primary objective had been achieved with identity confirmation and reunion establishment. The case thus moved to the post-investigation phase, where the focus was no longer evidence collection, but consequence management, ensuring achieved conclusions were accurately reflected in the system without creating new conflicts. The post-investigation phase also included completing summary reports, recording operational lessons, and updating case status in federal and state databases to ensure this instance could be referenced in future similar cases. Reunion, in that context, held not only personal meaning, but also became an operational milestone, demonstrating the system's capability, when modern science is combined with persistence, in preserving and re-examining old files. However, recording real-world consequences also required acknowledging that not every gap could be filled by identity confirmation, and that lost years could not be recreated by a single meeting. Reunion occurred in the present, with all its limitations, reflecting the reality that the case had shifted from searching to confronting, where truth is accepted but cannot erase time's consequences. In this process, involved parties gradually defined their roles in a newly re-established family structure, not by returning to the past, but by building connections suited to the present. The case moving to post-investigation also meant the legal and investigative system withdrew to make way for personal and family decisions, as from that point, what occurred no longer belonged to a case's scope, but to the private lives of affected individuals. Reunion was therefore recorded not as a perfect ending, but as a turning point, where the story shifted from investigation to consequences, from files to people, and from legal questions to ongoing real-world adjustments. In the overall case, this phase affirmed that resolving a cold case is not only about finding the right answer, but also about handling correctly what happens after that answer is given, a task requiring caution and humanity, no less than the investigation process itself. As the post-investigation phase began, and the authorities gradually stepped back from their central role, the deepest consequences of the case no longer lay in the files or final reports, but revealed themselves clearly in the personal and family lives of those involved, where the confirmed truth had to collide directly with the reality of more than half a century of separation. The personal impact on Barbara did not unfold as a moment of complete release, but as a complex series of adjustments, where having her identity restored did not immediately mean her sense of belonging was recovered. Knowing who she was biologically and legally brought a clarity that had never existed before, but it also raised new questions about how she had lived all that time under a different identity, and what place those experiences held in her life story. This change did not erase the life she had built, but forced Barbara to reconcile two layers of existence, one tied to her biological family and an interrupted past, the other tied to the relationships, habits, and choices that had formed in the present. The family impact also manifested in ways that could not be measured by legal criteria, as her blood relatives had to confront a truth that was both healing and painful, because the reunion confirmed that Barbara had survived. But it also affirmed that they had missed her entire journey of growing up. The expectations built up over years of searching and waiting could not be fully met in the present, because the person who returned was no longer the 7-year-old child who vanished in 1950, but a complete individual with a fully shaped life of her own. Family relationships, therefore, could not simply revert to the state before the incident, but had to be redefined in a new context, where blood ties existed alongside an undeniable estrangement. The unbridgeable distance became an obvious reality as time had created differences in experiences, memories, and worldviews, making the recovery of familiarity require long-term effort, rather than just initial emotional moments. Family stories retold could not replace the lost years, and key milestones in each person's life could not be recreated merely by a belated presence. The irreversibility of the past was something all parties involved had to face, as confirming identity and reuniting could only affect the present and future, not alter the decisions, losses, and consequences that had occurred over more than half a century. This truth set a clear limit on the meaning of resolving the case, reminding that justice and science could illuminate the truth, but could not restore the time that had passed. In Barbara's personal life, integrating the two streams of memory was not a linear process but one full of fluctuations, where moments of connection with her biological family could alternate with feelings of alienation and difficulty in locating herself. The family impact also extended to other generations, as children, grandchildren, and relatives had to learn to understand a family story that had just been revealed but could not be complete, where the prolonged absence had become part of the collective identity. The unbridgeable distance lay not only in the years of separation, but also in the differences in how each side had learned to live with the loss, one by continuing to search and wait, the other by building a life with no room for questions about origins. The irreversibility of the past was therefore not a failure of the investigation process, but an unavoidable reality, reflecting the limits of any effort to repair what time had shaped. The post-reunion phase showed that resolving a cold case is not just about closing a file, but about opening a chain of ongoing consequences, where the truth must be integrated into real life, rather than existing as an abstract conclusion. These impacts have no clear endpoint, because adjusting relationships, identity, and memories is an open process that unfolds at the individual pace of each person and family. In that context, the reunion is not seen as a complete ending, but as a transition, where old pain is placed alongside new opportunities, but is not erased. The irreversibility of the past also means accepting that part of the story will forever exist in the form of assumptions, questions, and gaps, and living with those gaps is the true challenge of the post-reunion phase. This part of the story is therefore not about closure, but about reflection, as the personal and family impacts are recognized as the inevitable consequences of a prolonged disappearance, where a truth that arrives late still has value but cannot replace what was lost. After the post-reunion phase, when the personal and family consequences became clearly recognized, the core remaining question of the case no longer focused on the victim's identity, but returned to the starting point that had been left unresolved for decades. Who took Barbara from Idaho in 1950, and how the event could occur without leaving traces strong enough to be detected at the time. The remaining hypotheses were reviewed once more by the cold case unit in the new context, not to pursue a specific suspect through traditional methods, but to assess the feasibility of each scenario based on what had now been confirmed about Barbara surviving and growing up under a different identity. Hypotheses that had been considered insufficiently grounded or too vague in the initial investigation phase were brought back for analysis, but with a different criterion, whether they could explain the decades-long identity change. Among them, the possibility that Barbara was taken by a known individual or someone with a certain level of access was considered more plausible than random scenarios, because a child leaving the area without drawing attention would require initial trust or a context that did not trigger defensive reactions. However, evaluating these hypotheses quickly encountered insurmountable limits of evidence, as no direct data remained to link a specific individual to the act of taking Barbara. Assessing prosecutability thus became a matter of realism rather than ambition, because the legal system does not operate on hypotheses, no matter how reasonable, without evidence meeting the required standard. Investigators had to consider whether any elements existed that could be used to build a case capable of holding up in court, from statements, physical evidence, to administrative records that could prove specific criminal acts. The reality showed that the lack of direct evidence was the biggest barrier, as all data related to the time of Barbara's disappearance had been blurred by time, key witnesses had passed away, or were no longer capable of providing reliable information, and no physical evidence had been preserved well enough for modern analysis. Even DNA evidence, which played a key role in confirming the victim's identity, provided no information about who took Barbara, as it only reflected blood relationships, not actions or motives. The lack of direct evidence meant that any hypothesis, no matter how carefully constructed, remained at the level of investigative speculation and could not be transformed into specific legal charges. Statutory limitations further clarified this reality, as many potential acts, if identifiable, might have exceeded the statute of limitations, especially given that the legal system half a century ago differed significantly from today's. Investigators had to compare each scenario against current legal frameworks, assessing whether there was basis to open a new criminal case, or whether continuing pursuit only held historical clarification value without potential for criminal accountability. In this process, the cold case unit did not seek to create a closing answer at any cost, but focused on determining the boundary between what could be known and what could not be proven. Acknowledging the lack of direct evidence was not seen as a failure of modern investigation, but as an inevitable consequence of a case occurring in an era when evidence collection and preservation systems were very limited. The remaining hypotheses were recorded in the file as historical possibilities, not as official conclusions, to ensure the story was reflected truthfully with the level of certainty the data allowed. Assessing prosecutability also included considering the social and personal impact of pursuing a potential suspect without sufficient evidence, as such action could cause unnecessary harm and would not align with modern justice standards. Statutory limitations thus served as a clear boundary, reminding that the system cannot impose current standards on a past too distant without corresponding data. In that context, the question of who took Barbara did not find a definitive answer, but it was neither ignored nor removed from the story. It was retained as an inseparable part of the case, reflecting the complexity and gaps that even modern science could not fully fill. Recording the remaining hypotheses helped place the case in a more honest context, where truth is layered by degrees of certainty, rather than forced into a single conclusion. The lack of direct evidence and statutory limitations simultaneously shaped how the case was closed at the investigative level, not with a verdict or indictment, but with a clear acknowledgement of what could be confirmed, and what would forever remain out of reach. This part of the story is therefore not about complete resolution, but about confrontation, as the investigative system accepts that finding Barbara again does not mean being able to fully reconstruct every detail of the 1950 event. Asking who took Barbara becomes a reminder of the limits of justice when too much time has passed, while emphasizing the value of what was achieved, restoring identity and basic truth to the victim, even when the rest of the story could not be written in the language of law. After all remaining hypotheses had been evaluated within practical investigative and legal frameworks, the system had to reach a conclusion that was more about acknowledgement than judgment. There was no basis to proceed with criminal prosecution against any individual related to the 1950 event of Barbara Lopez being taken. The decision not to prosecute did not stem from indifference or abandonment, but from a strict comparison between modern legal evidence standards and what remained after more than half a century, when direct evidence was gone. Witnesses could not provide legally valuable testimony, and any inference, no matter how reasonable, could not meet the threshold needed to hold up in court. In that context, the case was deemed solved regarding identity in a very specific and limited sense, the question of who Barbara Lopez was, and what happened to her existence, after disappearing had been answered through science and law. But the question of who bore criminal responsibility for the initial act could not be resolved in the same way. Declaring it solved did not mean every aspect of the case was clarified, but reflected a clear separation between two types of justice, identifying justice and punitive justice, where the first had been achieved while the second remained out of reach. The perpetrator, whether still alive or deceased, not being tried was not because they were exonerated or forgiven, but because the system lacked sufficient grounds for a lawful charge, and any effort to do otherwise would violate core principles of modern justice. The absence of a criminal trial posed an unavoidable paradox. A case could be resolved at the level of basic truth, yet still not reach a final judgment on responsibility, leaving the traditional sense of fairness unsatisfied. However, in this very gap, the concept of symbolic justice began to form as another way to view the outcome of the entire process. Symbolic justice does not seek punishment, but recognition. It does not aim to penalize individuals but to restore truth and acknowledge what had been denied or forgotten in history. In Barbara Lopez's case, restoring her identity, confirming her existence, and bringing her story into public light were seen as a form of justice, as it ended decades of anonymity and corrected a fundamental distortion in the record-keeping system. No trial meant no verdict, no ritualistic legal closing moment, but it also meant the case was not confined to an unfeasible prosecution framework, allowing the story to close in a different way. The decision not to prosecute criminally was communicated to the family and involved parties as an honest, unvarnished conclusion, in which the system acknowledged both what it had accomplished and what it could not. The case being declared solved regarding identity was updated in official databases, marking the shift from an unsolved missing person case to one where the victim and her journey had been identified, even if the perpetrator had not. This declaration held significant procedural importance, ensuring Barbara Lopez was no longer listed as an unidentified missing child, and that her story was fully recorded in Idaho's legal history. The perpetrator not being tried was an emotionally difficult reality to accept, but it also reflected the system's steadfastness in not sacrificing principles for public pressure or the desire to close the story at any cost. Symbolic justice, therefore, does not replace criminal justice, but exists alongside it as a way for society to confront cases where time has eroded the ability to pursue accountability. Within this framework, publicly releasing investigation results, recording past errors and limitations, and acknowledging the suffering endured by the family and victim became core elements of justice. No trial also meant no specific individual was framed as the villain in the official narrative, avoiding oversimplification of a complex event into a single potentially misleading image. Instead, the case was presented as a chain of consequences from historical context, investigative limitations, and irreversible personal decisions, allowing society to view it with greater maturity and caution. Symbolic justice in this instance lay in the truth being named correctly, the victim restored to her place in the story, and the system acknowledging that some things cannot be fixed but must still be remembered. Declaring it solved regarding identity was therefore not a complete full stop but a milestone, where the case moved from limbo to a state of being understood and recorded. Not prosecuting criminally did not diminish the value of the entire investigative process. On the contrary, it highlighted the difference between uncovering truth and punishment, two goals often linked but not always aligned. Justice without a trial in the Barbara Lopez case thus became a practical concept, where the outcome is measured, not by a verdict, but by the degree to which truth was restored, and decades-long silence was broken. This part of the story closes with the acknowledgement that justice, in some cases, does not appear in the form society is accustomed to, but it can still exist in another form, quieter, less dramatic, but no less important for those who lived too long in waiting and uncertainty. After the case was legally closed with the conclusion of no criminal prosecution and confirmation of the victim's identity, the entire investigative process of the Barbara Lopez case could be viewed as a series of interconnected phases, clearly reflecting the system's evolution from the limitations of the past to the capabilities of the present. The incident began like hundreds of other missing person cases in 1950s Idaho, where investigation relied almost entirely on witness statements, manual searches, and inference, leading to deadlock without direct evidence or technological support. The file becoming a cold case was not a sign of indifference, but an inevitable outcome of an era where the system had done all it could within allowed means. Decades passed with the case existing as a gap in local history, until the advent of DNA technology created an entirely new path to approach the old question. DNA's role in this cold case was not just providing scientific evidence, but overcoming barriers that paperwork, memory, and testimony could not, connecting seemingly unrelated data into a verifiable relationship. DNA did not solve the case on its own, but it created the starting point for a new chain of investigative actions, forcing the system to revisit what had been considered irreversible. Through genetic matching, the hypothesis of a parallel life was transformed into a specific investigative direction, leading to reopening the file, cross-timing two timelines, and ultimately legally confirming Barbara Lopez's identity after more than 6 decades. The value of reopening the file lay not only in the final outcome, but in the process, where old data was reread in a new language, old assumptions were re-questioned, and historical limitations were frankly acknowledged. Reopening showed that cold cases are not dead stories, but ones waiting for the right moment, tools and perspective to be reapproached. In this instance, the combination of biological data, cross-era analysis, and modern legal procedures allowed the system to achieve what the 1950 investigators could not, answering the core question of the victim's identity and fate. However, the case conclusion also clarified insurmountable limits, as the questions of who took Barbara and how remained without definitive answers. These unresolved questions were not failures of modern investigation, but consequences of time, evidence loss, and historical gaps that science or law could not fill. Acknowledging unanswered questions was an important part of the conclusion, as it reflected the system's honesty in distinguishing what could be confirmed from what could only be speculated. The Barbara Lopez case thus closed not with a verdict or trial, but with a truth restored at its most basic level. The victim had survived, had a life, and had her name returned. Summarizing the investigative process revealed a multi-layered picture, where justice did not appear in familiar form, but was present through restoring truth, recognizing loss, and correcting a long-standing distortion in the record system. DNA's role was affirmed not just as a technical tool, but as a factor changing how society approaches unresolved cases, opening the possibility that stories thought buried could still be brought to light if approached correctly. The value of reopening lay in not only resolving one specific case, but setting precedent and lessons for others, emphasizing the importance of preserving files, updating methods, and being ready to revisit the past when conditions change. Unresolved questions, though unanswered, served to remind of human and systemic limits, while affirming that lacking all answers does not diminish the meaning of what was achieved. The Barbara Lopez case conclusion was therefore not a traditional complete ending, but a responsible closure, where truth was confirmed, limitations acknowledged, and the value of investigative effort fully recognized. Overall, this story became evidence that justice can take many forms, and in cases spanning generations, restoring identity and truth to the victim may be the most important outcome the system can achieve, even when the past cannot be reversed, and some questions remain forever in history's silence. In today's America, the Barbara Lopez case reminds us of something very specific. Community safety cannot rely solely on the sense of peace, like in 1950s Idaho, where people believed children roaming freely was natural. The tragedy's breaking point started with a small detail. An unusual factor appeared. A witness hesitated, reassured themselves, and ignored the danger signal, creating a critical time gap that police later could not fill with testimony. The practical lesson is, in modern life, at schools, malls, parks, churches, agree in advance with children on the rule. Stop, find a safe person, do not go with strangers, and for accompanying adults, have a quick response principle. Note the last scene moment. Lock down the area. Call for help immediately, instead of searching independently too long. The investigation in the story also shows another lesson. Paperwork and memory can be wrong, while data does not play favorites. Barbara lived her whole life under an identity, lacking clear original records. Administrative inconsistencies smoldered, but no one had a mechanism to cross-check until DNA appeared, and genetic links forced the system to reopen the file and confirm the truth. In today's American life, every family should proactively store copies of birth certificates, medical records, age-progressed identification photos, and understand privacy rights when taking commercial DNA tests. It can be a bridge to rediscovering origins, but it also carries social consequences. Finally, justice without a trial in this case reminds us that justice is sometimes restoring identity and truth, not always punishment, and that makes prevention from the very first minute even more important. If you believe that reopening each cold case is not just to find the perpetrator, but to restore identity, memory, and truth to the victim, as in Barbara Lopez's story, please subscribe to the channel to join us on journeys to reclaim justice forgotten by time. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where another file thought to be long asleep may be awakened.